December 7, 1941. Oda District, Tokyo, Japan. Through his office window, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto could see the Imperial Palace grounds bathed in morning light. Celebrations erupted in the streets below as news of the Pearl Harbor attacks spread through the capital. In the past 12 hours, Japanese carrier planes had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 2,400 Americans dead, 350 aircraft destroyed. The attack had been a tactical masterpiece. Japanese naval aviators had achieved complete surprise, executing their mission with extraordinary skill and courage. Yet Yamamoto sat alone in his office, consumed by dread rather than triumph. He had studied in America. He had stood on Harvard's campus, walked the streets of Boston and Chicago, seen factories that never slept, and industrial belts that stretched beyond the horizon. He knew something his government refused to admit. Japan could win battles, but America could win a war. In Tokyo newspapers, Pearl Harbor looked like a decisive victory. On the streets, people cheered as if the war were already over. But Yamamoto saw a different timeline, a ticking clock. 6 months, he told his closest staff officers in private. Japan had 6 months of momentum. After that, America would awaken. And when it did, the empire would face a force unlike anything seen in human history. But those voices were dismissed as caution, not prophecy. Tokyo believed America was soft, industrially powerful, yes, but spiritually weak. Japan's war planners convinced themselves that democracy could not stomach prolonged casualties. Hitler had crushed France in 6 weeks. Japan believed it could crush American morale just as fast. A single decisive strike, they argued, would shock Washington into negotiation, not mobilization. From the outside, Pearl Harbor looked like dominance. Inside Yamamoto's mind, it already looked like destiny approaching from the opposite direction. Because the true danger Japan had awakened was not American anger. It was American momentum. Yamamoto's private fear, that Pearl Harbor was the beginning of the war, not the end of it, was confirmed almost immediately in Washington, D.C. Because while the Japanese public celebrated, the United States did something Tokyo never anticipated. It did not fracture, it did not hesitate, and it did not negotiate. It unified. The morning after the attack, Roosevelt addressed Congress for just 7 minutes. No theatrics, no flowery rhetoric, just one sentence that would echo across the Pacific for generations. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. 33 minutes later, the United States was at war. But the real shock wasn't the declaration itself. It was the speed of the mobilization that followed. Japan thought America would need a year just to reorganize. It took 1 week. Factories that built refrigerators and washing machines were ordered to stop civilian production by executive order. By December 19th, not even 2 weeks after the attack, the War Production Office was formed. Bills that would normally take months to crawl through Congress were passed overnight with bipartisan support so overwhelming that the opposition was statistically irrelevant. What Japan believed would be a demoralized, panicked democracy instead became a singular war machine. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. Henry Ford's Rouge plant, already the largest industrial complex in the world, received a new directive. Military output first, everything else second. By January 1942, design teams were on 24-hour shifts. By February, the first converted assembly lines were already producing aircraft parts. By spring, entire fighter wings were rolling directly off civilian car assembly lines. Women entered the workforce in numbers Japan dismissed as impossible. The Japanese imperial staff believed America was too soft, dependent on male labor. They assumed that once men went overseas, production would collapse. Instead, American women stepped into factories, tool shops, drafting rooms, and aircraft plants by the millions. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a poster. It was infrastructure. The Navy replaced in 6 months what it had lost in decades. Before Pearl Harbor, fleet carriers total by the end of 1942 alone. New carriers commissioned or under high-speed construction, 50 T-40+. Escort carriers approved, hundreds of new destroyers, frigates, and support ships laid down. Japan didn't just wake a sleeping giant. It woke one whose industrial hands were already bigger than its entire empire. But mobilization wasn't just steel and ships. It was psychology. Pearl Harbor erased the last isolationists in Congress. It eliminated hesitation in the public. It rewired American patience from stay out of foreign wars to not only will we fight, we will finish it. And Roosevelt understood something Yamamoto understood as well. You don't win wars with your first punch. You win them with your second, third, fourth, and 50th, after the enemy realizes you have more left than they can ever destroy. And so while Japan celebrated a headline victory, America was already drafting the blueprint for strategic revenge. The turning point wasn't Midway. It wasn't Guadalcanal. It wasn't the Doolittle raid. The real turning point happened in the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, when the United States proved it could transition from peace economy to wartime superpower faster than any nation in human history. A transformation so rapid that by the time Japanese commanders recognized it, their 6-month window, the very window Yamamoto warned them about, was already closing. The countdown to American retaliation had begun. Japan believed America's industrial response would be measured in years, slow, bureaucratic, encumbered by debate. But by January 1942, the United States was already shifting from rearmament into full-scale war manufacturing. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in the Navy's carrier program. Because Pearl Harbor didn't actually cripple the U.S. Navy the way Tokyo believed. They destroyed the battleships. Yes, but the battleships were already becoming obsolete. The aircraft carriers, the real striking arm of the modern fleet, were not in port on December 7th. That single fact meant Japan had won a tactical victory, but failed strategically. And in those first 6 months, America didn't just replace its navy, it reinvented it. Industry goes to war, at warp speed. February 1942, Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast introduced an unheard-of concept, modular shipbuilding. Instead of building a vessel start to finish in one place, components were constructed simultaneously in different locations and then assembled like a giant naval puzzle. A carrier that once took 2 to 3 years to build could now be completed in months. By June 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had already launched the USS Essex, the first in a class of fleet carriers that would become the backbone of American naval supremacy in the Pacific. Japan assumed America had 7 carriers. By the war's midpoint, it had dozens. The math was no longer survivable for Tokyo. Air power. The silent explosion Japan believed it had destroyed America's naval air wings at Pearl Harbor. In reality, it had only destroyed parked aircraft. Production lines were already standing by, and now they were unleashed. In 1941, the U.S. built 19,000 aircraft. In 1942, almost 50,000. By 1943, 86,000. Japan's total wartime aircraft production from 1941-45, approximately 76,000. America built more in a single year than Japan built in the entire war. The Japanese Army and Navy never accounted for this scale, because no nation in history had ever produced machines at that speed before. The human engine they never factored. In Japan built its empire on a rigid belief. Victory comes from elite warriors, tradition and hierarchy. America won with something Tokyo dismissed as weakness. Civilian capacity. Housewives became welders, bookkeepers became riveters, students became precision machinists, draftsmen became weapons engineers. The Japanese high command believed democracy made people soft. Instead, it made everyone part of the war machine. While Japan relied on a warrior caste, America weaponized an entire population. The empire's clock starts ticking. By March 1942, U.S. shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than the Japanese Navy could sink them. What Tokyo believed would be a long war of attrition was rapidly turning into a production race. And in a production race against the United States, Japan was already doomed. But perhaps the greatest miscalculation was cultural. Japanese officers believed Americans feared death and therefore would break easily in combat. They didn't understand that Pearl Harbor didn't frighten America. It infuriated it. The country wasn't fighting for territory. It was fighting for vengeance, and vengeance scales far faster than ideology. By spring 1942, Yamamoto's nightmare had begun to materialize. The 6-month window, the short period of Japanese dominance he predicted in private, was already beginning to close. The U.S. wasn't just recovering, it was accelerating. It was organizing. And most importantly, it was preparing to hit back, not symbolically, not slowly, but with industrial force so great that no empire could withstand it. By April 1942, Japan still believed it controlled the initiative in the Pacific. Its armies were advancing in Burma. The Philippines were on the brink of collapse, and Imperial Navy planners convinced themselves that America would dig in defensively for at least a year. They had no idea the U.S. was about to do something they believed physically impossible, strike the Japanese homeland itself. That strike came in a form Japan never imagined, twin-engine Army bombers flying from the deck of a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. The Doolittle Gamble Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz understood something Yamamoto feared, but Tokyo ignored. Japanese morale was built on invincibility. The public believed the empire was untouchable, proved they weren't safe, and Japan would be forced onto defense far earlier than planned. That's where Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle entered history. He wasn't just a bomber pilot. He was a mathematician, a racing legend, and one of the most gifted aviation minds of the 20th century. When the idea was floated to launch B-25 Mitchell bombers from a carrier, even senior naval aviators laughed. Impossible. Too heavy. No bomber can take off from a carrier. Doolittle's response? Then we'll do it anyway. A secret departure, the USS Hornet steamed west under total secrecy. On its deck, 16 B-25 Mitchells modified for extended fuel, stripped of unnecessary weight. The mission was simple. Bomb Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, then escape to China. It wasn't a militarily significant strike. The bombs themselves would do minimal industrial damage. But psychologically, it would shatter the illusion of Japanese homeland security. Tokyo believed the Pacific was an impenetrable moat. Doolittle was going to prove it was a runway, an early launch, and a new messaging. April 18, 1942, spotted prematurely by a Japanese picket boat, Admiral Halsey gave the order to launch 600 miles earlier than planned. The men understood instantly. Most of them would not have enough fuel to reach their escape airfields in China. They went anyway. One by one, the B-25s roared down the short carrier deck. Crews were silent. This was not a mission of survival. It was a message written in aviation fuel and steel. We're coming. Tokyo. First strike on the Empire, raid sirens wailed over Tokyo. Civilians scrambled in disbelief. Japanese propaganda had told them attacks on the homeland were impossible. Anti-aircraft crews didn't even know what they were shooting at. No one believed American bombers could be overhead. The material damage was small. The psychological shock was enormous. The myth of invulnerability, gone in a single morning. Strategic panic. Japan reacted not with calm military calculation, but with humiliation and fury. New air defense. Commands were created overnight. Fighters were redeployed. Away from frontline operations. Strategic planning shifted from offense to homeland protection. Most importantly, the Doolittle raid directly forced Japan into its worst strategic mistake of the war, overextending at midway 2 months later. Instead of consolidating gains, Yamamoto now felt compelled to draw out and destroy the American carriers once and for all. He wasn't planning a victory anymore. He was planning revenge. And revenge is a poor strategist. The real impact: none of the Doolittle crews reached their intended airfields. Many crash-landed or bailed out in China. Some were executed by the Japanese, but their mission achieved something far greater than damage to factories. It proved America could strike back before Japan expected. Not years later, but within 5 months of Pearl Harbor. It proved the U.S. possessed both the imagination and the will to break the rules of conventional warfare, and it proved that Japan's window of dominance was closing much earlier than its admirals predicted. While the American public was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, inside Washington the tone turned from disbelief to relentless urgency. President Franklin Roosevelt understood instantly that the United States could not simply repair what had been destroyed. It had to outbuild, outlast, and ultimately outrun Japan. Pearl Harbor was not the end of something. It was the ignition point of the largest industrial and naval surge in human history. In Tokyo, Japanese leadership believed they had executed the perfect lightning strike. Their projection was simple. America would sue for peace before Japan ever had to face a prolonged war of attrition. They believed the American people were soft, the government indecisive, the industrial base too scattered and slow to respond, and most importantly, that rebuilding a Pacific fleet would take years, not months. They were catastrophically wrong. Within 3 days of Pearl Harbor, the United States had already begun a mobilization effort larger than the combined steel output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The factories that had once produced refrigerators, cars, elevators, and farm machinery were converted practically overnight into assembly lines for aircraft, bombers, destroyers, rifles, and ammunition. Plants that had never manufactured a single wing segment were suddenly turning out whole fighters in modular form that could be assembled at combat speed. And while this manufacturing hurricane roared to life, another transformation was happening quietly: the forging of a new kind of navy. The United States did not try to rebuild a battleship fleet resembling the one Japan had crippled. Instead, it pivoted into the carrier era with terrifying speed and focus. Every scrap of naval intelligence coming out of Pearl Harbor made one thing clear. The age of the battleship was dying. Carriers, mobile airfields able to strike at 200 miles and disappear, were the new kings of the sea. Instead of replacing battleships, America replaced doctrine. This was a shift Japan neither anticipated nor prepared for. The Pearl Harbor attack had disabled 8 U.S. battleships, but the American carriers were by pure chance out at sea and untouched. The victory Japan was celebrating was an illusion. They had sunk monuments. America was about to build weapons of momentum. By January 1942, U.S. shipyards were launching hulls at a pace the Japanese Naval Command believed physically impossible. Carriers that previously required years of construction began rolling off the slips in months. The Essex-class fleet carriers, the backbone of the Pacific comeback, entered development not as gradual replacements, but as an assembly line fleet system. The Navy no longer thought in terms of ships, it thought in terms of numbers. Sea control was no longer a question of what could defeat a Yamato-class battleship in a duel. It was a question of how many carrier groups could strike Japan, from how many directions at once. But industry alone didn't turn Pearl Harbor from disaster into strategy. The intelligence war was already turning. Immediately after the attack, American cryptographers resumed work on the unfinished cracking of the Japanese naval code system known as JN-25. They worked out of nondescript rooms in Pearl Harbor and Washington, sometimes with nothing more than chalkboards, hand-built frequency charts, and captured weather transmissions. By February, they were reading fragments. By March, entire phrases. And by April, the U.S. was beginning to see the skeleton of Japanese fleet movements before they happened. This was the first invisible reversal of the war. To the Japanese military, America still appeared stunned. To the U.S. Naval Command, Japan had already begun to bleed information, location, intention, and timing. The empire still believed it was dictating momentum, but from the moment those first signals were decrypted, Tokyo was no longer the hunter. It was the observed. Meanwhile, something else shifted inside American command culture. The purpose of the war. Pearl Harbor had triggered more than mobilization. It had awakened unity. Every factory worker, welder, railway operator, and shipyard rigger was no longer an industrial civilian. They were a combatant. The United States wasn't just replacing what had been lost. It was building beyond capacity, preparing to fight across oceans, hemispheres, and years if needed. In short, Japan believed it had shattered American will. Instead, it had detonated it. What Tokyo misread as submission was actually transition. The era of battleship pride was over. The age of carrier warfare, mass-produced, fast-moving, intelligence-driven, and industrially unstoppable, had been born in the smoke of Pearl Harbor. The clock had started, and America was already accelerating. The Japanese High Command believed the United States would need 2 to 3 years to meaningfully re-enter the Pacific. But by March 1942, just 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy was already shifting from survival to counterpunch. The first outward sign of this shift didn't take place at sea, but in planning rooms inside the War Department, plans for an attack that, on paper, should have been impossible. A direct strike on the Japanese home islands. No navy in world history had ever launched an air attack against the Japanese mainland. Japan believed its geographic isolation was invincible. Its admirals were certain that after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would fight defensively, clinging to Hawaii and reinforcing California. They expected delay. America delivered audacity. This was the seed of the Doolittle raid. Not a decisive battle. Not even a strategic strike, but a psychological missile aimed straight at Tokyo's confidence. 16 B-25 bombers, land-based aircraft never designed to fly off a carrier deck, would be positioned aboard the USS Hornet, escorted by USS Enterprise. The mission was so daring that even the officers planning it called it one-way air power. They knew the bombers could not return to the carriers. They would have to race westward after their attack and land in China or ditch at sea. This was not a military necessity. This was a message: you are not untouchable. While preparations for the Doolittle raid quietly advanced, another transformation was happening. Carrier doctrine was evolving in real time. The U.S. Navy didn't just field carriers, it learned how to fight with them. Unlike the Imperial Japanese Navy, which tended to group carriers side by side in large but vulnerable formations, the United States dispersed and layered its task forces to minimize catastrophic losses. The Japanese fleet operated like a samurai, deadly in a duel. The U.S. fleet was beginning to operate like a boxer. Footwork, angles, timing, and hits that added up over distance. Even more critical was the accelerating intelligence pipeline. By early April 1942, U.S. cryptographers had made a breakthrough. They were now decrypting strategic-level Japanese signals. The Japanese believed their naval code was mathematically unbreakable. It used 30,000 possible code groups. But American analysts weren't breaking it purely by calculation. They were mapping patterns, rhythms, weather reports, logistics chatter, the invisible fingerprints of naval behavior. What Japan thought was secrecy was becoming signal. This is the part of the story often overlooked. America did not beat Japan through brute force alone. America beat Japan by knowing what Japan would do before Japan did it. Industrial mobilization gave America its arms. Intelligence gave America its timing. Carrier doctrine gave America its reach. And national fury gave America its fuel. By late April, the stage for the first major American counterstrike was set. Not a decisive battle, but the opening move of a campaign that would eventually collapse Japan's war timetable entirely. To Tokyo's leadership, the United States still looked like a crippled giant trying to stand. They saw shipyards rebuilding battleships and assumed this was the core effort. They didn't see the tidal wave forming offshore, the one built not of steel alone, but of industrial arithmetic. Japan built weapons individually. America built them systematically. Japan built war machines. America built war output. This was the single biggest miscalculation of the entire Pacific War. Pearl Harbor was supposed to buy Japan time. Instead, it awakened America's most dangerous weapon, production at scale, fed by ideology, revenge, and limitless manufacturing infrastructure. The Japanese timeline forecast? 6 months of momentum, negotiation. But the actual timeline became 6 months of momentum, collision. The United States wasn't bracing for survival anymore. It was accelerating toward confrontation. And that breaking point, the moment when Japan's offensive turned into strategic retreat, would arrive faster than their admirals believed possible. Not in 1944, not in 1943. It began in May 1942. At a place Japan assumed would be another easy victory. The Coral Sea, the world's first carrier versus carrier battle. The first time in naval history, two fleets would destroy each other without ever seeing one another directly. This was no longer battleship warfare. This was aviation chess at oceanic scale. Pearl Harbor had been the last gasp of the old world. The Coral Sea would be the rehearsal for the new one. And just beyond it, waiting like a guillotine, was Midway. The Battle of the Coral Sea was not supposed to happen. Not according to Japanese planning. They believed the U.S. Pacific Fleet was still stunned, still rebuilding, still psychologically anchored to Pearl Harbor's smoking wreckage. But instead of cowering behind Hawaii, the U.S. Navy sailed south, into waters Japan believed it controlled. The Japanese objective was Port Moresby, New Guinea. Capture it, and Japan could isolate Australia, threaten U.S. supply lines, and extend its shield deep into the South Pacific. 2 Japanese fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, escorted invasion forces. Tokyo expected another steamroll. What they got instead was the first carrier duel in history. For the first time, naval forces clashed without ever visually sighting one another. Aircraft became the eyes, the fists, and the armor. Fleets hid beyond the horizon, trading strikes through wings instead of guns. The battle opened as a mirror image exchange of destruction. U.S. planes struck the Japanese light carrier Shoho first. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon radioed history's now famous words, "Scratch one flat top." This was the first Japanese carrier ever sunk by U.S. forces. But the cost was severe. Japan counterpunched and crippled the USS Lexington, the Lady Lex, which eventually had to be scuttled after internal fires reached her aviation fuel stores. The USS Yorktown limped out battered. On tactical scorecards, observers called Coral Sea a draw, or even a Japanese tactical victory. But strategically, it was an American triumph of incalculable weight. The Port Moresby invasion had to be cancelled. Japan's timetable was cracked open. Momentum, the single greatest Japanese advantage, had been interrupted. Even more important, 2 Japanese carriers did not make it to the next battlefield. Shokaku was heavily damaged. Zuikaku's air group was wiped out, its pilots gone. Those missing carriers would mean everything 1 month later at Midway. While Coral Sea was still unfolding, U.S. intelligence had already decoded the next Japanese move. A massive strike aimed directly at Midway Atoll, luring the crippled American carrier force into a trap. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed they would finish the job. Started at Pearl Harbor, they assumed American intelligence was blind. They assumed the U.S. Navy was still reactive. They assumed Yamamoto still controlled the initiative. All three assumptions were about to be shattered. Unlike 1941, when U.S. forces stumbled into disaster, 1942 was now a battlefield of anticipation. Admiral Nimitz didn't just know where Japan was headed. He knew when they would be there. Midway would not be an ambush against America. It would be an ambush by America. But here was the most stunning truth of all. By the time the Japanese fleet left its home ports for Midway, the U.S. Navy already had its carriers hidden and waiting in a position Japanese planners never imagined. In Tokyo's strategy rooms, victory was guaranteed. On the open Pacific, they were already sailing into a coffin made of radios, signals, and broken encryption tables. Coral Sea was not a standalone event. It was the hinge. It proved three things simultaneously. The U.S. Navy could block Japanese expansion. Carrier warfare was now the true law of the Pacific. American intelligence was no longer reactive, but predictive. And psychologically, perhaps most important of all, it was the first time Japanese naval officers realized their enemy would not accept the script. The United States wasn't merely trying to buy time. It was already trying to seize control of time itself. Japan believed Pearl Harbor won them 6 months of breathing room. But now, 6 months later, America was breathing fire. Coral Sea wasn't a knockout, it was a pivot. The first break in Japan's rhythm. The first time Japanese admirals looked across the chessboard and realized the other player wasn't stunned. He was studying them. And at Midway, America would do more than counterstrike. It would reverse the entire trajectory of the Pacific War in just 72 hours. The world was about to witness the most decisive naval battle in modern history. Not because of ship tonnage, or numerical advantage or superior firepower, but because of information, positioning, and timing so precise it bordered on destiny. Midway wasn't chance. Midway was correction, and the correction would be catastrophic, but only for one side. June 4th, 1942. Dawn over the Pacific. The Japanese fleet is steaming confidently toward Midway, convinced they hold every advantage. 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The largest, most experienced carrier force in history. Their pilots are the most seasoned naval aviators in the world. Their doctrine is polished, rehearsed, and victorious everywhere it has been tested. Japan believed they were the hunters. They didn't realize they were already the prey. Because while Japanese reconnaissance planes scoured the ocean in the wrong direction, 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered but still fighting Yorktown, were positioned northeast of Midway, lying in wait like a coiled blade. This is where Yamamoto's worst fear begins to take shape. For weeks, American cryptanalysts had tracked Japanese planning and radio coordination traffic. The target, once just AF in code, had been confirmed as Midway by one small trick. U.S. operators sent a fake unsecured transmission saying Midway's water desalination plant has broken. We are low on fresh water. Hours later, Japanese code traffic reported AF low on water. AF was Midway. Japan had been exposed. The trap was set. Before 7 a.m., Japan launched its first strike. Bombers hammering Midway Island, but the U.S. did something unthinkable. They struck back immediately. Marine dive bombers and torpedo squadrons launched from Midway itself, flying straight into the jaws of the most elite carrier defense screen on Earth. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and in many cases flying slower, outdated planes. They were slaughtered. But their sacrifice mattered. Those early attacks dragged Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, chasing torpedo bombers skimming the waves, which meant Japan's skies were momentarily undefended above 10,000 feet. At 10:22 a.m., everything changed in a single 251-second window, less than 5 minutes. 3 U.S. dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead, by sheer timing, just as Japanese carriers were rearming, refueling, and loading decks with live munitions for their next strike. Their flight decks were packed with bombs and fuel lines. The Japanese defensive fighters were all pointed the wrong direction. The kill zone was wide open. Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bombers into a near-vertical descent. What happened next is one of the most devastating single tactical blows in naval history. Kaga, hit multiple times, became a rolling firestorm. Akagi, Yamamoto's flagship, struck cleanly amidships and instantly crippled. Soryu, engulfed. Deck crews incinerated before they could even move ordnance below. 3 frontline carriers destroyed in minutes. Not hours. The Imperial Japanese Navy went from predator to crippled giant before the smoke even began to rise. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. One carrier remained, Hiryu, whose captain launched a desperate counterattack that struck Yorktown. The fight seesawed violently. Yorktown, already damaged from Coral Sea, absorbed crippling blows, but stayed afloat long enough for U.S. pilots to take revenge. That afternoon, American dive bombers located Hiryu. They sent her to the bottom too. By sundown, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the same strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone forever. The heart of Japanese naval aviation was obliterated in a single day. But the deeper loss wasn't steel or fuel or carriers. It was pilots. Japan could not replace them. America could. Yamamoto had feared this moment from the beginning, the moment Japan stopped dictating the war and America started shaping it. In destroying 4 carriers, the United States didn't just win a battle. It rearranged the strategic geometry of the entire Pacific. Japan went to Midway expecting another Pearl Harbor. Instead, they met the day Pearl Harbor ended. Midway wasn't revenge. Midway was transformation. The Pacific War had just flipped completely. And forever. The shock of Midway didn't end on June 4th. In many ways, it began there. Because from that day forward, Japan was no longer dictating the terms of the Pacific War. The strategic initiative swung like a pendulum, and it never swung back. Before Midway, the United States was reacting. After Midway, the United States was advancing. Just 34 days later, August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive of the war. The timetable is astonishing. In barely 1 month after annihilating Japan's carrier strike force, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were already pushing into Japanese territory. This was something imperial planners believed would take the Americans years to attempt. If they even tried at all, Japan assumed a slow mobilization. Instead, America showed industrial velocity. Guadalcanal was brutal. Not a sweeping victory like Midway, but a grinding test of endurance. Japan still fought with elite infantry and fanatical air superiority doctrine, but there was a quiet shift happening that Japan could neither see nor stop. Japan was fighting the same pilots over and over again. America was fighting new pilots trained by the hundreds, and those new pilots were flying aircraft born from the crash industrial program ignited after Pearl Harbor. The same 6-month transformation that Yamamoto had privately feared. Wildcats evolved into Hellcats. Dauntless dive bombers gave way to the SB-2C Helldiver. The mass-produced Avenger torpedo bomber replaced the obsolete Devastator. Meanwhile, U.S. shipyards launched destroyers, carriers, and transports faster than Japan could repair theirs. While Japan lost irreplaceable veterans, America was manufacturing replacements. In steel and in human capital. That was the real turning point Midway had quietly created. From August through December 1942, Guadalcanal became a war of attrition, and for the first time, Japan was on the losing end of attrition. Fuel shortages hit their naval operations. Pilot fatigue crippled combat efficiency. Each Japanese carrier strike group that sailed into combat returned home weaker than when it departed. But for the Americans, each month they returned stronger. Carrier doctrine evolved too. Fast. What had been desperation improvisation in early 1942 became refined tactical science by early 1943. American carrier groups developed layered fighter direction, radar-assisted intercepts, and coordinated strike packages that no other navy on Earth could match. Japan had started the war with high skill, low quantity. America ended 1942 with greater quantity and rapidly rising skill. The most decisive shift was psychological. Before Midway, Japanese commanders believed America was soft, decadent, incapable of enduring a long war. After Midway and Guadalcanal, they understood the truth. America wasn't soft. America was slow to anger, but unstoppable once awakened. The 6 months Yamamoto predicted, they didn't just prove him right. They proved him prophetic. By early 1943, U.S. naval intelligence could read nearly every Japanese operational move before the first plane even took off. Pacific carriers that had been hidden under tarps in December 1941 were now prowling Japanese sea lanes like wolves. Strategically, the initiative chain was complete. Pearl Harbor, U.S. forced into war mobilization, factories, pilots, carriers Midway, Japanese naval strike power crippled Guadalcanal. Japan bleeds out manpower and fuel 1943 onward. U.S. shifts to full offensive warfare. Japan had won the first strike. America had won the last direction. 6 months earlier, Japan's navy looked untouchable. 6 months later, Japan was already losing a war it no longer had the industrial oxygen to sustain. This wasn't luck. It wasn't miracle. It was industrial war, logistical mastery, and the refusal to surrender momentum. Midway was the pivot, but what followed was the proof. America wasn't fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for victory. As 1944 turned to 1945, the illusion that Pearl Harbor would win the war had fully evaporated. What Japan had hoped would be a short, decisive conflict had become a relentless war of attrition, one they could no longer sustain. America had not only replaced the ships and aircraft lost at Pearl Harbor, it had surpassed them many times over. Every month brought more carriers, more submarines, more bombers, and more trained pilots than Japan could ever put back into the field. The crucial difference was no longer tactics, but capacity. While Japan's war machine shrank, America's expanded with unstoppable momentum. Factories ran day and night, and U.S. shipyards built entire fleets faster than Japan could sink them. For every Japanese carrier lost, America launched 3 more. For every ace pilot killed, Japan replaced him with a barely trained cadet. Meanwhile, American command understood the psychological dimension of the war. Pearl Harbor had enraged, not frightened, the American people. Instead of pushing the U.S. out of the Pacific, the attack united the American public behind total victory. Japan had awakened a democratic superpower with industrial strength no empire could match. By mid-1945, with Japan's navy crippled, its skies undefended, and its industry collapsing from B-29 raids, the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. The 6-month window Japan had counted on had long passed. What was supposed to be a stunning knockout blow had become the very reason for Japan's defeat. Pearl Harbor was meant to intimidate America. Instead, it transformed it. Japan had gambled everything on speed and surprise. But America won through endurance, organization, and overwhelming force. The empire that believed it could win in months was now fighting simply to survive.